Let's continue now with the story. International Relations Minister Naledi Pandor has defended her call with Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh earlier this month, despite criticism from certain quarters, including the South African Jewish Board of Deputies. The board has raised issues with Hamas's charter that calls for Jews and the Jewish state to be destroyed. The board says Pandor's communication with Hamas and her visit to Iran would be laughable if it did not have such serious international implications and consequences for our country. Now, let's discuss this. We're now joined via Teams by Professor Karen Milner, National Chairperson of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies. Prof, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. South Africa has always repeatedly maintained its position for calling on the cessation of the war. Of course, the war, we know, has claimed the lives of more than 9,800 people on both sides. Just your comments on South Africa's stance so far.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me on, and a very warm good afternoon to everybody on this very sad, very cold, very rainy day. Sad for the world. And I think that it's important to understand that everybody, I hope, in this arena is interested in peace. But what we have seen from Minister Pandor over the last couple of weeks in relation to the Middle East context has been nothing short of a real, I suppose, the best way I could put it would be misstep. I think that would be the most positive way I could put it. The worst way I could put it is that it feels as if she is certainly engaging with Hamas and did so, engaged with Hamas very, very soon after Hamas had undertaken its horrific attacks on Israel. So I think that there's been a lot of communication and a lot of things going on, but it leaves us with a central position, and that is what we object to so vehemently, which is that our Minister of Foreign Affairs approached an ISIS, or didn't approach, had a call with an ISIS-like terrorist organization. And I say ISIS-like because the type of terror that they released on that day was very much an ISIS-style terror. And she gave them a call and engaged with them almost within a couple of days of them doing so. And I don't think that is helpful from a diplomatic point of view. I think that it is appalling from a human rights point of view. And that does not mean that I don't have, and the Jewish community and the Jewish Boards of Deputies don't have, are devastated by the innocent loss of life in this war, including in Gaza. But to have our Minister of Foreign Affairs, before even addressing anything that happened in relation to the attack on Israel, her first port of call is Hamas and the person who ordered that attack. I'm not sure how, as a South African citizen, it doesn't matter, in my mind as a Jew, how as a South African citizen, I cannot see that as outrageous.
I can't speak for the minister, but I know that she has come out to say that South Africa was looking at various vantage points in which to intervene in a war that has now been going over 3 weeks in terms of finding a peaceful solution and to end the war in Gaza. But in terms of your position, what do you say to Israel's continued bombardment of Gaza, particularly as we are hearing that over 3,000 children in the Gaza Strip have now died, and that there are problems, in getting crucial aid into Gaza at this point in time, where a humanitarian crisis is now reaching boiling point? Your comment on that?
Sure, and I want to start my comment again. I noticed in the latest Dirco statement, they talk about South African Muslim citizens who have family in Gaza who were killed. And I want to really express my deepest condolence. There are no winners in this war. It is an absolutely tragic, tragic war. But we also need to see, and I think it's really important, this is a war started by Hamas. And what's happening is it's a war happening where we have hostages in Gaza. I think the war, the ceasefire talks and all of that can happen quite easily once those hostages are released. And that's something that I really haven't seen being pushed within the South African Dirco and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs narrative. If you're looking for peace in Gaza, you can't do that over the hostage taking. So there are Israeli hostages sitting in Gaza that Hamas is refusing to release. Hamas held that responsibility and is in control. They could release them. Any attempt to find peace surely has to focus on that.
Prof, my question is really centered around the fact that this war didn't start on the 7th of October. We know that this is an ongoing war that has historic reasons behind them that date back 75 years now. So I'm asking you, as the Jewish Board of, of Deputies in South Africa, your response to the continuous bombardment of Gaza by Israel, and the fact that the Prime Minister of Israel has said that he will not stop the bombardment until Hamas is destroyed. At the center of this, we know, are innocent civilians. What is your standpoint on that?
Sure. So I think I've made my standpoint on the innocent civilians very clear. It's an absolute tragedy. And when you say that this war didn't on the 7th of October, it might not have, but something changed in the world in the 7th of October. It wasn't just another event in an ongoing skirmish between neighboring countries. It was an outrage, as I said, of ISIS-like proportions that did change the situation in ways that I think we're still going to be grappling with for many, many years to come. Having said that, I do think it's important, if you're asking historically, and I think it is worth mentioning a little bit about the history of Gaza. So if you're asking historically, I think it's important to remember that Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza in 2005. There were many people living, many Jews living in Gaza at the time. Every single one of them was removed from their homes, some of them forcibly from their homes. They were taken out of Gaza and moved into Israel. That happened in 2005. There was then an election. At a later stage, Hamas won a parliamentary election in Gaza, and soon after that, they had a mini kind of altercation or a mini civil war, if you want, with what's now the Palestinian Authority, with the Fatah faction of the Palestinians. They forcibly overthrew that Fatah faction, and they took control of Gaza at that point. I think it's very important to understand there has not been another election in Gaza since then. So that's the kind of government that you're dealing with in Gaza. And up until that point, Gaza and Israel were operating quite effectively, quite peacefully. It was only once Hamas took over and began violently attacking Israel that Israel began responding, firstly, and secondly, in protection of its citizens. Obviously, it had to protect itself. It couldn't allow rockets to come into Gaza, and that's when that's when they cut off certain supplies to Gaza. But that was done not in 2005. It wasn't done as an occupying force. It was done only once Hamas came in and began a violent assault on Israel.
Prof, let me ask you just one final question before we wrap up this conversation. Just recently, the UN Security General Antonio Guterres was accused of anti-Semitism by Israel when he was, in fact, calling for an immediate ceasefire, something that we also heard in the General Assembly, and the end to the continuous bombardment of Gaza. Perhaps, maybe coming from you, just explain to us why the distinction is not drawn between, anti-Zionist statements and its ideology versus anti-Semitism, as in the hatred of Jewish people.
Sure, thanks. That's a great question. So I think it's quite important that criticism of Israel, criticism of its government is valid. And no one would ever argue, certainly not me. I have been a quite vocal critic of the Israeli government. there's no reason why valid criticism of the Israeli government that is equivalent to valid criticism of a government anywhere in the world is not anti-Semitic. So the same way as in South Africa, you get criticism of the South African government that is absolutely valid, and then sometimes you get criticism of the South African government, which we all know is actually quite racist. And that's the kind of, that's the closest analogy that I can bring to this. So criticism of the Israeli government when they're doing something wrong, if it's a democracy, you can criticize it, and in fact Israelis do so all the time. When you criticize the Israeli government to the point where, firstly, it's a kind of demonization, to the point where you deny the right of the Jews to their own homeland. So in other words, there's only one Jewish state, to the point where you say that Jewish state shouldn't exist, and to the point where you say at some level that it is acceptable to kidnap or take hostage, and that the country that has had its citizens taken hostage shouldn't take every means at their disposal to get those hostages back. And you do that against the only Jewish state, that does begin to feel like it's anti-Semitic. So that's the difference. Normal criticism of a country is absolutely valid. Denying the country the right to exist, demonizing it, denying their right to defend themselves, denying basically their right to any kind of human dignity, which is what we're talking about when we're talking about baby hostages, two of them sitting there without their parents.
Yeah, Prof,
and ignoring that.
Yeah, Prof, I think
calling for a ceasefire.
Yeah, I think we get that, Prof. Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. I think we get that. Thank you so much for your views. Of course, those are the views of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, and that was Professor Karen Milner, the National Chairperson.